My parents said there was no money for college while funding my brother's perfect life, until I found a secret folder that exposed what I did at 16 and why they lied for years. I'm 31 now, and for most of my adult life, I had a clean, simple story about my family. My older brother, Daniel, was the one my parents loved correctly. I was the one they loved out of obligation. He got the version of them that planned ahead, showed up early, asked questions, wrote checks, and bragged to relatives. I got the version that said things like, "We're all making sacrifices," while I was working closing shifts at a grocery store and trying to stay awake in an 8 a.m. macroeconomics class. Daniel is 4 years older than me, polished in a way I've never been. He was the kind of kid who put his shoes in the same place every day and remembered teachers' birthdays. I was not a screw-up exactly, but I was always the one with a ripped backpack, a forgotten permission slip, a teacher comment about great potential if he applied himself. When Daniel got into college, my parents were radiant. My mom cried in the driveway. My dad took him out to buy a laptop the same weekend. They paid his tuition, his rent, his books, even the stupid meal plan he complained about nonstop. When I got into school 4 years later, the speech was different. "We wish we could do more. Things changed. You'll understand when you're older." I remember standing at the kitchen counter with my acceptance letter in my hand, while my mom explained federal loans like she was reading weather updates. Calm, detached, almost rehearsed. My dad kept rubbing his thumb over the edge of his coffee mug, not looking at me. I asked the obvious question. Why was there money for Daniel and not for me? My mother said, "Life isn't always equal. Not fair. Not comforting. Equal." That word lodged somewhere sharp in me. I took out loans. Then more loans. I worked at the campus bookstore, then drove deliveries at night, then picked up weekend shifts at a warehouse one summer that left my hands cracked and bleeding from cardboard dust. I slept in my car between classes more than once because commuting home to save money made more sense than paying for campus housing. Every time I mailed in a tuition payment or signed another loan document, the resentment hardened. Daniel graduated debt-free and moved into a decent apartment in the city. I graduated owing enough money to make every choice after that feel temporary. I delayed grad school, delayed moving, delayed relationships, delayed everything. I wasn't just behind. I was financed into being behind. And the worst part was that nobody in my family ever openly admitted what it looked like. They acted like my bitterness was a personality flaw. Like I'd invented this story because I needed something to blame. At holidays, my aunt would say, "Daniel was always so driven." And my mom would go quiet in that particular way that meant she agreed with her. Once, after too many beers on Christmas Eve, I said, "It's easier to be driven when someone else is paying." Nobody answered. Daniel just stared into his glass. That should have told me something. Instead, I took it as proof. I spent years believing I knew exactly what happened in my family. I was wrong, just not in the way I thought. The story stayed stable for a long time because stable stories are useful. They help you know where to put your anger. Mine was simple. Daniel was the favorite, and I was the one they expected to survive disappointment quietly. It explained a lot. Why my mom still framed his achievements like they had happened last week. Why my dad used the phrase, "Your brother has always been responsible," so often it sounded laminated. Why every conversation about money around me got tense and clipped. It also explained Daniel, or at least I thought it did. He never rubbed anything in my face, which somehow made it worse. If he'd been smug, I could have hated him cleanly. Instead, he was careful, mild, reasonable. The kind of older brother who'd pick up the check at dinner once in a while and ask how work was going and never mention that he started his adult life with no debt while mine arrived chained to me. That kind of kindness can feel insulting when you don't ask for it. I remember one Thanksgiving about 6 years ago. I just found out my student loan payment was going up again, and I was already stretched thin. Daniel was talking to my cousin about taking a weekend trip to Montreal with his girlfriend. My mom was laughing. My dad was pouring wine. It was all so normal, so easy for them. I said, "Must be nice to have room in the budget for international leisure." The whole table went quiet. Daniel looked at me for a second, then said, "You don't have to do this every time." That line still embarrasses me because I did exactly what he accused me of. Every time. Not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. A little jab here, a comment there. When my parents mentioned helping Daniel with a down payment on his first condo, I said, "Good to know the scholarship program is still active." When my father asked why I rented instead of buying, I laughed. With what? The family trust? My mother once cried after I left early from Easter. Daniel called me the next day and said, "You can be angry. Just stop pretending they ruined your life on purpose." I told him he didn't get to lecture me from the cushion side of history. He went quiet, and then he said something that only makes sense to me now. "You really don't remember, do you?" I asked, "Remember what?" But he backed off immediately. Said never mind. Said I was in a mood. Then he changed the subject to baseball, which at the time felt like classic Daniel. Step close, then retreat, keep everything manageable, never actually say the thing. I didn't forget that moment though. I filed it away with all the others. The odd pauses, the glances between him and my parents when I brought up money, the way my mother would leave the room sometimes when college came up, the way my father's expression changed, not guilty exactly, but tired, like he'd been carrying something heavy for too long and resented being asked to lift it again. Still, I stayed loyal to my version, because the alternative was harder. If I wasn't the overlooked son, then what was I? If they hadn't chosen him, then why had they let me believe they had? And why had Daniel, who apparently knew something I didn't, kept letting me sit there year after year and make myself uglier with half the truth? The thing that broke the story wasn't some huge confrontation. It was a box. My parents sold the house last fall, not because of some crisis. They're both in their 60s now, and the stairs were getting old before they were. My mom wanted a one-floor condo with less yard work and better lighting. My dad wanted to stop fixing gutters for the rest of his natural life. For once, they agreed quickly. So we all came over one Saturday to clear out the attic, the basement, the hall closet full of dead batteries and extension cords nobody could throw away. I almost didn't go. Family projects have a way of turning into emotional hostage situations. But my mother had that strained, hopeful tone on the phone, and I'd been trying, in small, inconsistent ways, to be less difficult. Daniel was already there when I arrived, hauling banker's boxes down from the attic in a gray t-shirt soaked through with sweat. He gave me the usual half smile and said, "Morning." No edge, no warmth either. We'd settled into a kind of adult truce over the years. Functional, not close. Around noon, my mother asked me to help sort old paperwork at the dining room table. Insurance forms, tax returns, appliance manuals for machines nobody owned anymore. Most of it was junk. Then I found a battered accordion folder labeled in my father's handwriting, "Boys, Education." Even now, I can remember the weird little kick in my stomach. My first thought was honestly, of course. I opened it expecting confirmation. Maybe old account statements showing exactly how much had gone toward Daniel and how little toward me. I wanted numbers. I wanted something concrete I could resent with adult precision. There were two subfolders inside. One had Daniel's name. One had mine. For a second that actually threw me. I just stared at them. My name in block letters, same as his. Same pen. Same age-yellowed paper. I opened Daniel's first. Statements from a state college savings plan. Deposit slips. Notes about tuition disbursements. Predictable. Clean. Then I opened mine. At first it looked similar. Contributions over years, birthday money from grandparents, monthly deposits from my parents. There was more in there than I expected. A lot more. Enough that, if left alone, it would have covered most of what I needed. I remember reading the early statements twice because my brain kept snagging on the same fact. They had saved for me too. Not less. Not symbolically. Actually saved. Then the statements changed. There was a withdrawal. Large. Then another. Then the account was nearly emptied within a span of months right before I turned 17. Paper-clipped to one statement was a letter from the bank confirming the liquidation and transfer. Under that, an invoice from a law firm I didn't recognize. Under that, a payment receipt from a hospital. Law firm. Hospital. I kept flipping pages faster, like speed might create sense. There were more documents. Medical billing. Something from an outpatient rehab facility. A letter marked confidential with my parents' address and my name typed in the subject line. I stopped there because my chest had gone tight in a way I didn't understand. My mother was in the kitchen, talking to Daniel about donation bags. I called out, trying to sound normal. "Mom?" She turned, saw the folder in my hand, and the color left her face so quickly it was like watching a light switch flip. That's the moment I knew this wasn't about favoritism. It was about something they had buried so completely that even finding the paperwork felt like I'd walked into a room in my own house that wasn't supposed to exist. I asked one question. "What is this?" Not loud. Not dramatic. Just flat. My mother crossed the room faster than I'd seen her move in years. She reached for the folder on instinct, which of course made me pull it back. My father came in from the garage with a box in his arms, took one look at us, and set it down without a word. Daniel was behind them in the doorway. He had that same expression he'd had on Thanksgiving years earlier. Not surprised. Not confused. Just braced. That did something ugly to me immediately. I held up one of the statements. "You had money for me." Nobody answered. I tried again. "You saved for me. You told me there wasn't money." My father said quietly, "There was money." The room went dead still after that. I don't know what I expected next. An explanation, maybe. Some reasonable accounting issue. A bad investment. A debt. I was still trying to fit this into the old story somehow, just with more paperwork. Then I held up the hospital receipt. "And this? What is this?" My mother sat down at the table like her knees gave out. She didn't cry right away, which somehow made it worse. She just looked exhausted. My father stayed standing, one hand on the back of a chair. Daniel kept not looking at me. It was my dad who said it. "You got hurt." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. When you were 16, I said. I know I got hurt at 16. I broke my collarbone at that party by the quarry. Even saying it, fragments came back. Warm beer, gravel, a pickup truck, someone yelling. Then the blank, fuzzy part my memory has always treated like damaged film. My father shook his head. That's not all that happened. It turns out there are things your own mind can sand down if enough adults around you help. I knew, in the abstract, that I had a rough patch in high school. I'd always described it that way. Rough patch, acting out, bad crowd, vague phrases that let everybody feel honest without being specific. What I didn't know, what apparently everyone in that room besides me had known for 15 years, was that the party by the quarry ended with a car, a ditch, and a 17-year-old girl in the passenger seat who almost died. Her name was Tessa. I knew that name. I remembered freckles, black nail polish, a chipped front tooth. I remembered liking her. I remembered thinking she was invincible, because that's what you think about people when you're 16 and stupid and desperate to be seen as older than you are. I do not remember getting into the car. I do not remember driving. My father told me I had been drinking for hours. Someone had handed me pills too. Painkillers. Maybe. Nobody was ever clear. Tessa got in the car with me because she didn't want me going alone. I took a turn too fast on a dirt road and rolled the car into a drainage embankment. I walked away with a concussion, a fractured collarbone, and enough memory damage that the whole event collapsed into disconnected flashes. Tessa spent weeks in the hospital, then months in rehab. I just stood there listening, feeling like I was being told about another person wearing my face. Then my mother said the part that rearranged everything. She was going to sue. Her parents were. There were criminal charges being discussed. We were told to prepare for the worst. The law firm, the hospital bills, the rehab payments, my college fund, gone. Because of me. I sat down because suddenly I couldn't feel my legs right. There are moments where emotion arrives in order. Shock, then anger, then grief. This wasn't like that. It all hit at once and canceled itself out. I felt sick, furious, embarrassed, defensive, hollow, like my body couldn't decide what emergency to prioritize. I said, "Why don't I know this?" My mother gave me a look I still don't know how to interpret. Love maybe. Fear too. Because you barely remembered any of it after the concussion. And after the first few weeks, every doctor told us stress would make your symptoms worse. My father added. Then when Tessa stabilized, her family agreed not to pursue charges if we covered what insurance didn't, plus rehab, plus certain legal conditions. There were lawyers, agreements, counseling, restrictions. I said, "Restrictions?" No one answered right away. Daniel finally spoke. "You weren't allowed to contact her." I turned to him so fast my neck hurt. "You knew?" He didn't deny it. The memory gap had always been a strange family blind spot. There had been jokes about how I partied too hard and should have gotten my act together after that summer. But nobody ever told the story straight. I'd apparently filled the silence with the version that made me look reckless, but not catastrophic. I remembered my parents becoming weirdly strict after that. I remembered drug testing, curfews, counseling I resented and did not take seriously. I remembered my mom crying in the laundry room one night and my dad snapping at me over things that felt too small to justify the level of anger. Now those memories changed shape. This wasn't overprotectiveness after a teenage phase. This was triage after disaster. I asked, "So you paid everything?" My father nodded once. "Everything we could. With my college fund. With both savings and a second mortgage and cashing out part of retirement and help from your grandfather. It wasn't just your account." That detail should have softened something in me. It didn't. Not yet. Because underneath the nausea, a different question had started growing teeth. "If this is true," I said, looking from my parents to Daniel, "why did you still pay for his college?" My mother closed her eyes for a second. Daniel answered before she could. "Because I delayed a year." I stared at him. He said, "I was supposed to start that fall." I didn't. I stayed local. I worked. I commuted the first year because money was gone and things were still bad. I had no idea. Not because he'd hidden some dramatic sacrifice. Because nobody had ever framed it that way. In family lore, Daniel's college had always sounded seamless. Maybe because by the time I was old enough to compare, the crisis had already been converted into silence. He kept going. By the time I transferred, Mom and Dad had stabilized some things. Grandpa helped. I had scholarships too. I said, "But you still got help." He looked at me then, properly, for the first time. "Yeah, and I knew you probably wouldn't." That was the first truly cruel thing anyone said that afternoon. Not in tone. In truth, I felt heat rise into my face. You knew I thought they chose you. He looked away again, and there it was. The thing under the thing. Not just the secret. Not just the money. Not just the fact that a huge part of my adult resentment had been built on missing information. My brother had known that I was wrong, and he let me keep being wrong. For years. I wish I could say I handled that discovery like a mature adult with nuance and patience. I didn't. I went straight past confusion and into anger because anger at least gave me somewhere to stand. I asked my parents why nobody ever told me once I was older. 21, 25, 30. Any age where I could have held the truth without breaking in half. My mom said, because every time we tried to talk about that time in your life, you spiraled. My father said, and because we were ashamed. Those are different answers, but both can be true. Ashamed of me, I almost said, but even then I knew that wasn't all of it. Ashamed of what I did, sure. Ashamed of how they managed it. Ashamed of burying it so deep that the lie became structural. Apparently after the crash, there had been months where nobody knew what kind of damage I'd done, legally or medically. Tessa survived, but with a long recovery. Her parents hated us, reasonably. My parents were advised by attorneys not to discuss details loosely, especially around me, while the concussion symptoms were still severe and I was seeing neurologists. Then the crisis evolved into settlement, therapy, probation-like conditions without formal charges, and a family-wide habit of not saying things out loud. My mother told me there had been one serious conversation attempt when I was 19, just before college applications. You got angry before we finished the first sentence. I said, about what? She said, about money. That tracked. Too well. I'd built so much of my identity around being the less supported son that any explanation probably sounded like cover-up before it even landed. But Daniel. I couldn't let go of Daniel. After my parents went upstairs, my mother crying now, my father following in that helpless, stiff-backed way men of his generation follow any emotion they can't repair, I stayed in the dining room pretending to sort papers I wasn't seeing. Daniel came back 10 minutes later with 2 glasses of water like we were in a mediation room. He set one down in front of me. I said, don't. He sat anyway. For a while neither of us spoke. Then I asked, why didn't you correct me? He rubbed a hand over his face. He looked older than usual, less composed. At first because it wasn't my story to tell. That's convenient. It's also true. I laughed once. Come on. He nodded. Fine. Then later? Because the longer it went on, the harder it got. That answer made me angrier than any excuse would have. He said, you were furious all the time. At them. At me. If I corrected you, it sounded like I was defending myself with information you didn't have. Like I was winning. I said, you were winning. His jaw tightened. You think I felt like I won? Then, because life apparently enjoys timing, he told me something else I didn't know. After the accident, when things were at their worst, he'd been the one visiting Tessa's family with my father, dropping off paperwork, sitting in waiting rooms, hearing updates I was too concussed or too protected to hear. He said Tessa's dad once told him, at least one of your sons knows how to look people in the eye. That line had apparently lived in him for 15 years. I should have felt sympathy. Instead, I felt this ugly split down the middle. Because maybe he had suffered too. And maybe he still let me become the villain of a fake story because it was easier than reopening the real one. Both can be true. That's the part nobody tells you about family secrets. They don't replace resentment. They complicate it until you don't know where to aim. The next week felt like recovering from a concussion I didn't know I still had. I went to work, answered emails, sat through meetings, and had the constant eerie feeling that my life had been misfiled. Every familiar memory now had a shadow version behind it. I called in sick that Friday and drove nowhere in particular for 2 hours before ending up outside the old road near the quarry. It looked smaller than I remembered, which is usually how it goes. Places that hold your mythology rarely cooperate in daylight. There was a fresh guardrail now, new paving, different trees. The road had the nerve to look ordinary. I sat there and tried to force memories loose. Some came. Tessa laughing with her feet on the dashboard. The smell of stale beer and dirt. My own voice, loud and slurred, saying I was fine. Then a blank wall. I don't know what I expected from standing near the place. Punishment, maybe. Clarity. Instead, I got a headache and a weird sense of fraud. Because how do you feel guilty about something you don't remember doing when the evidence is undeniable? How do you grieve harm you caused when your mind has spared you the sensory details that might make it real enough? That same afternoon, I called my mother and asked the question I'd been avoiding. What happened to Tessa? My mother went quiet, then said she married a physical therapist and lives in Oregon now. She has kids. She's okay. Okay is a slippery word. Apparently my parents had kept distant track through mutual contacts for a while, then less over time. Not in a creepy way. In a guilty way. The kind where you want assurance your worst act didn't permanently destroy someone, but you know you don't deserve updates. I asked if I had ever apologized. My mother said yes. I have no memory of that either. She said there was a letter from me during therapy, supervised, after the legal pieces were settled. She doesn't know if Tessa ever answered. I asked if they still had it. She said maybe. That night Daniel texted, "You want to get a beer?" I nearly ignored it. Then I said yes because I was tired of carrying entire arguments in my head with absent people. We met at a place halfway between our apartments. Quiet, decent food, men in quarter zips talking too loudly about mortgages. Daniel arrived early like always. I hated that I noticed. For a while we talked around the edges. Work, Dad's back. Whether Mom would hate condo living after 2 months. Then I asked him again, more calmly this time. Did you ever think I deserved to know? He took a long sip before answering. Every year. That hit harder than I expected. He said he drafted versions of the conversation in his head dozens of times. When I made comments about favoritism. When I got angry at family dinners. When I snapped at Mom over helping him with his condo. He said there were moments he almost told me, then thought, not like this. Not in front of everyone. Not when he's already boiling. I said, so you let me humiliate myself instead. He didn't argue. Then he said the one thing that has bothered me ever since. Part of me was angry too. I asked, at me? He nodded. For what you did. For what it cost everyone. For the fact that you got to forget the worst of it, and the rest of us didn't. There it was. Brutal, clean, maybe overdue. I should have hated him for saying it. Instead I understood it immediately. And I hated that more. A few days later my mother found the letter. She called first to ask whether I was sure I wanted it. That annoyed me on principle. I'm 31, not unstable. But then when she handed me the envelope at their condo, I understood the question. The paper was thin and cheap, probably from some therapist's office printer. My name wasn't on it, just Tessa's. The handwriting was mine, teenage but trying hard not to look childish. It started stiff and formal, then got shakier halfway through. There were details in it I still don't consciously remember. Being told I asked for her in the hospital, crying when someone explained she couldn't see me, saying I knew sorry was not enough and probably insulting. I had written, I don't know how to be a person after this. That line gutted me because it sounded true in a way that crossed time. Like some early version of me had already sensed that one terrible night was going to split everything into before and after, whether I remembered it or not. There was no reply in the envelope. Just mine. My mother said Tessa's family never sent anything back, but their lawyer acknowledged receipt. That was it. I took the letter home and read it 3 more times. Then I did something I probably shouldn't have. I searched her online. I know. Bad instinct. Selfish instinct. Whatever word fits. But once someone stops being a sealed family secret and becomes a real adult somewhere with a life, it's hard not to want proof. Not absolution, exactly. Just shape. I found very little. A professional profile for a rehab clinic. A race result from a charity 10K. A blurry photo in someone else's post, standing with 2 kids and holding one of those paper cups from a school event. She looked healthy. Tired maybe. Normal. I stared at that photo longer than I want to admit. Not because I expected some dramatic sign from the universe. Because normal was the hardest thing to process. I had turned her into a symbol without meaning to. The injured girl from the story my family hid. But she was just a woman with a life that continued around the wreckage I caused. I closed the laptop and sat in silence for a while. This is the part where some stories convert into redemption. The narrator reaches out, makes amends, learns a clean lesson. I didn't do that. I don't think I had the right. Maybe one day. Maybe never. Some wounds do not belong to the person who caused them once enough years have passed. Instead, I went to my parents' condo for dinner the next Sunday. First time since the attic. Nobody wanted to start. We ate chicken, green beans, some oversalted rice my father insisted was fine. Finally, my mom said, "We should have told you sooner." It was the simplest truthful thing she'd said in years. My father nodded. "We thought we were protecting you. Then we were protecting ourselves." Also true. I asked why they let me keep believing Daniel was favored. My mother looked miserable. Because correcting you meant telling the whole story, and we were cowards. Daniel came in late from work and heard the last part. He set his keys down and said, "Yeah, no defense. Just yes." I almost respected that. What I still don't know is whether honesty this late counts as healing or just delayed damage. Maybe both. Since then, I've been walking around with emotions that do not line up neatly enough to explain to anyone. Resentment is still there. That's the ugliest part. Not all of it died when the truth arrived. I resent that my parents lied by omission for 15 years and let me build an identity around a false imbalance. I resent that Daniel knew and chose silence, even if his reasons were complicated. I resent being the last person to understand my own life. And then there's guilt, which is newer but somehow older too. like it was waiting under the floorboards this whole time. I caused something terrible. Even if I don't remember every second, I did it. People paid for it in money, in stress, in time, in shame, in injury, in whatever version of trust never grew back afterward. My college fund wasn't taken from me by random cruelty. It was consumed by a fire I helped start. That truth changes the moral geometry, but it doesn't make the emotional math simple. I told a close friend about all of this a couple weeks ago, and he made the mistake of saying, "Well, at least now you know your parents didn't love your brother more." At least. I know he meant well, but I almost laughed in his face. Because now I know they did save for me. Great. I also know that the money vanished cleaning up a catastrophe tied to my name, that my family collectively chose secrecy over honesty, and that my brother watched me carry the wrong story into adulthood and never once sat me down and said, "You're angry at the wrong thing." This is where nuance gets exhausting. Everyone in my family can be understandable and still have failed me. I can have been the cause of the original disaster and still feel betrayed by the way the aftermath was handled. Daniel can have carried burdens I didn't see and still be guilty of benefiting from my ignorance. A few nights ago, he came over to help me move a couch I bought off Marketplace. We got pizza afterward because apparently that's what men in my family do instead of speaking directly until furniture is involved. At one point he said, "I'm sorry." Just that. I asked for knowing. He said, "For letting you hate us for the wrong reasons. And maybe for being relieved it wasn't aimed at the real ones." I looked at him for a long time after that, because that was the first truly honest thing he'd given me. Not noble, not polished, not older brother reasonable, just ugly and human. He had been relieved. Of course he had. If my anger was about favoritism, then nobody had to reopen the car, the hospital, Tessa, the debt, the years of fallout. My resentment became the family's decoy narrative. Painful, but manageable. Cleaner than the truth. That realization almost impressed me in a bleak way. Families will live inside a lesser lie for decades if it means avoiding a bigger one. I don't know what forgiveness looks like here. I don't even know if forgiveness is the right project. Mostly, I feel like someone handed me a map of my life with different borders and told me to keep driving. Last Sunday, I went back to my parents' old house one last time before closing. It was almost empty. The echo had started. That strange stripped-down feeling houses get when they've stopped pretending they belong to one family and are waiting to become scenery in someone else's life. I stood in my old room for a while, looking at the faded patch on the wall where a poster used to hang. Then I went downstairs and sat at the dining room table where I found the folder. Same table, different story. I tried to take inventory. My parents did save for me. They also hid the reason it disappeared. My brother was not exactly the favorite. He was also not innocent. I was not the overlooked son in the way I thought. I was also not crazy for feeling something was off. That's the hardest part. Realizing your interpretation was wrong, but your pain was still real. I think about those years in college a lot now. The jobs, the exhaustion, the humiliation of pretending not to worry about money all the time. That version of me still matters. He didn't know what I know. He only knew that help had once existed in that family and somehow did not arrive for him. Of course he got bitter. Of course he built a story that made the imbalance make sense. I also think about the 16-year-old version of me I can barely access now. The one in the letter writing, "I don't know how to be a person after this." Maybe nobody around him knew either. Maybe that's what all the silence was. Not strategy, not even favoritism. Just terrified adults building a life raft out of avoidance and calling it protection. That interpretation feels kinder. I'm not sure I believe it every day. Before I left, I found Daniel in the garage loading the last boxes into his car. We stood there for a minute in the cold, not saying much. Then I asked him, "Did you ever hate me?" He took longer than I expected. "Sometimes," he said. I nodded because honesty deserves honesty. "I hated you too." He gave a short laugh at that. Not amused, just tired. I know. Then we kept loading boxes. That's where things are now. Not healed, not shattered either, just exposed. I still have loans. I still have resentment. I now also have guilt and a kind of grief for the years I spent aiming my anger at a simpler target because the real one was hidden behind it. Sometimes I feel sorry for my parents. Sometimes I can barely look at them. Sometimes I think Daniel was doing his best. Sometimes I think he liked being the good son too much to risk losing the role. Most of the time I don't know what I think. I just know that the story I carried for half my life is gone, and the truth that replaced it did not set me free. It just made everything heavier and more accurate. And maybe that's adulthood. Not finding out who was right. Just learning how many people can be wrong at once, including you.